Well, welcome everyone to the ARM meeting on the Med. This morning's panel is about trends and challenges in developing gene therapies across Europe. And I'm joined by four esteemed panelists who will each introduce themselves after I just give a little bit of an overview of the segments that we'll discuss during the panel. First, we're going to start out with the discussion about some of the trends and challenges of gene therapy research in Europe. Then we'll move on to challenges related to clinical development, regulatory frameworks, and the challenges of actually operationalizing gene therapy research and development across Europe. Then we'll spend some time talking about how to best bring the patient voice to the development of transformational gene therapies for the patient communities that we all collectively serve. Then we'll round out with a conversation of insights and thoughts about where the gene therapy field is moving beyond 2021 across Europe, and have these insights available to the audience as you are able to ask chat questions to us during the course of the panel. And with that as an introduction, I'll also just share a little bit about myself. I'm Bob Smith. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Global Gene Therapy business at Pfizer. I've been in this role for about 6 years now, and it's been an exciting career progression for me, operating and leading our global gene therapy business. So I'm very pleased to serve as a moderator / panelist this morning. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amy for her to introduce herself.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with a great panel and always a wonderful gathering for the ARM meetings. So my name is Amy DuRoss. I am the CEO and a co-founder of Vineti, an enterprise software as a service orchestration platform for personalized medicine, including, of course, cell and gene therapies. Our software provides the critical path support to ensure that the right patients receive the right therapies at the right time. I am first and foremost, however, a patient advocate. I got that start early in life, in childhood, still my primary identity today. My background includes policy. I was the co-author and served as the executive director for the $3 billion stem cell initiative in California, which established the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which just reauthorized last November for another $5.5 billion in funding. I've also had chapters in venture capital and precision medicine, early stage enterprise. Again, really great opportunity to be here for this discussion. Really looking forward to it.
Great, thanks, Amy. Durhane?
Thank you very much. Durhane Wong-Rieger. I am also in Canada, but at the other end of the country in Toronto. I am president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, which is a national alliance of rare disease patient groups, 100 or so patient organizations here in Canada. I also serve as chair of Rare Diseases International, which is our global alliance of rare disease organizations, including national organizations and disease-specific international organizations. So we represent patients from about 100 different countries between the alliances and the international patient groups. And certainly, cell and gene therapies is a huge focus in the rare disease world, and probably the one actually most of the therapy people. This is, of course, of major interest to us. I'm also just alongside of this, I really appreciate Bob and the invitation here, because we are also launching our patient education and awareness workshop series on cell and gene therapies. We've done one session and we're hoping to do a great deal more. And we do recognize that we need to get that education out much more broadly to that patient community, not just to those who immediately have gene therapies available, but to the broader audience. And in some of my discussions, and certainly in looking at and presaging some of the topics here, I think we also have to let some of the patients know that, not everybody's going to get a gene therapy. And what are the huge challenges, as you say, in terms of not just developing them, but also the clinical trials. Not everybody's going to get into a clinical trial. So I'm hoping that when I get done with this panel, I'm not going to be more depressed than I am optimistic. So this is the job of everybody here, is to make sure that we walk away kind of thinking the patients feel good about where this is going, as opposed to, oh my gosh, we've got so many challenges here. But no, I appreciate so very much the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Durhane, and we're very pleased to have you join us. And we will leave you with a feeling of joy in your heart at the end of this panel discussion. With that, I'll turn it to Jean-Philippe to introduce himself.
Thank you, Bob and Anne, for this invitation. So I'm Jean-Philippe Combal. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vivet Therapeutics. It's a gene therapy company really dedicated to liver metabolic disorder, and we treat orphan and ultra-orphan disorder, where liver transplantation is sometimes only the curing single approach. And also I'm the chairman of Spanish biotech called Splice Bio. So I hope we can share some kind of passion and perseverance we have, and I hope that will help Durhane to understand what that patience, I would say, and passion we have will give us a lot of future and good vision and courage we need to have sometimes.
Great, thanks, Jean-Philippe. And Michael, my dear friend and former colleague, we worked together at Pfizer some years ago when we started our gene therapy initiative, and very pleased to have you join us, Michael.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you all for having me in this panel. It's almost not real in this environment to be on a panel again, so it's great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm Michael Linden. I'm the co-founder of Handl Therapeutics, a gene therapy company that was formed with the idea in mind to identify pathways that can migrate gene therapies or gene therapy approaches from the genetically defined diseases into more genetically complex diseases, and we're working in the space of neurodegeneration. Quite recently, Handl was acquired by UCB, so it's now a wholly owned company of UCB, and we're trying to do a little bit what we started to way back when at Pfizer, and that is to adapt an advanced therapeutic modality to the realities of drug development in the context of the pros of a pharma company. And I think that's really exciting because at the end of the day, this is the environment where medicines are really made and get to go to the market, and being part of that is super exciting.
Well,
so my background, maybe quickly, I'm a recovering academic. I've studied AAV for about 30 plus years, AAV and AAV gene therapy in the US and the UK, and then joined Pfizer, joined the real world at Pfizer, where we worked with Bob for a while. And after that, I started forming the ideas for Handl Therapeutics.
Well, Michael, I would use the words renowned and highly regarded academic rather than the way you described yourself. But with that as a background for everyone, for the audience, you get to know our panelists, and we'll kick off maybe with Michael, you and Jean-Philippe, to share your thoughts about how the research environment in Europe is currently, where we stand today versus just the recent past. Maybe some thoughts on how you see some of the recent successes and maybe some challenges that we're facing as a research community within the gene therapy field across Europe. So Michael, maybe you can start us off, and then all the panelists feel free to weigh in with your thoughts and insights.
Yeah, so I'm very excited to be here in Europe. We're located in Leuven in Belgium, which of course has the KU Leuven, quite a good university right next to it. And I'm excited in parts because I see the wealth of programs and potential programs that are being studied in places around Europe. There's a lot of activities, but it's very differently structured than it is in the US, where there are many more connections in academia to entities that would enable commercialization of good ideas, that would enable the development of actual medicines out of research programs. So when I look around, I see a lot of programs that are there. What I don't see are mechanisms really to develop these programs into something that could easily become drug development path. And I think there Europe has a benefit and a drawback. And the benefit is it's quite rich in its pipeline, I think, in academia with regards to gene therapy, but it's relatively poor at harvesting it. And in parts, the mechanisms are just missing. And I think it might be an interesting discussion to have. What could those mechanisms be to allow us to really explore all of the potential that this modality really brings with it?
Well, certainly we know that there's some interesting compares and contrasts of operating in Europe versus other jurisdictions like the US. And Jean-Philippe, maybe if you could share a little bit of your perspective operating as the CEO of a gene therapy focused biotech company based in Paris. We benefit from your insights.
Effectively, but we're not only based in Paris, but we have a very significant research and translational arm in Spain with the CIMA Center in Pamplona, where our CSO and co-founder Gloria Gonzalez is running the research. I think if I try to put a first helicopter view of where, if you look at the R&D investment globally, I mean, if you look at Germany and UK, they have significantly increased over the last 10 years. In France, it has decreased by 28% between 2011 and 2018. That's giving you a trend. And I think that's also coming from the comments of Michael, is how to transform idea into companies and innovation. So there's a lack at some point of the ecosystem in France. I not want to do specific French bashing, but I want to look at how things have differently evolved between the UK, between Germany, Spain, and eventually Swiss. We can talk about it, and Belgium. But there's been very good success in Belgium, and recently one is the two acquisition actually, with Belgian facilities for plasmids and for manufacturing. But if you look at the research in the university, there's a contrast between the impact of a lack of public research funding and the good science and the good ecosystem on how to train scientists. So what we see now, there's a lot of very good scientists which are actually not operating in France. They're operating in the US, or they actually moved to Germany, the recent Nobel Prize. But there's more than that. I mean, we're lacking a kind of a confidence in the whole ecosystem. And one thing might be the GMO regulation, for example, that simply had a significant impact in Europe. And that's something we need to think about, this global regulation. So globally, I think we had a very good ecosystem that we can actually amplify more. And there's very good scientists, very good science. It's well exported, I would say, at some point in the US. But we really need to reinforce this ecosystem to be able to go from science to innovative companies, well-funded, and to bioproduction. And this is where we may miss some, I would say, we lost some momentum, and we may miss some link at some point. But there's good science, so we need to get it well, I would say, structured, instead of having, in quotes, US investors picking up very good European science back in the US. And that goes from science to investment.
Maybe I can add to that. I fully agree with you on this aspect here as well. So when I look at the gene therapy development paradigm, really, there's sort of three major entities that drive the development. There are very many ideas still in academia, some of which get by accident picked up by biotech and then developed. And this is really an accident. Somebody has to know somebody in order to actually move this forward. And then there's a third entity of pharma. And what that does is it creates these transition points. How do you transition a good idea from academia into a drug development process, let's say, for example, in biotech? That's non-trivial, and I think we have to think out of the box. The example that Handl did is we said, well, we actually co-localize with an academic lab that shares our mission, because we identified that the core drivers in these three different entities are quite different. The core driver in academia is, of course, discovery, papers, grants. The core driver in biotech, I have to say, very often is a financial exit, if not always. And the core driver in pharma is to make medicines. And what we've done in our example, and this is only one of, I think, potentially many ways of bridging these gaps, is we've early on, we've actually co-located with an academic lab. So our lab is actually not our lab, it's an academic collaborator, but at the same place. And on the other hand, we've collaborated with a pharma from day one on when we founded the company. And what that did is it facilitated the transition from biotech to pharma. So we didn't want to lose those 2 to 3 years that one can lose after acquisition. So we prepared it from day one. So I think a little bit thinking outside of the box could go a long way of facilitating some of this. But then, of course, the finance is a big issue. I think the risk profile in Europe when it comes to financing these entities is still quite a bit different from the US. And again, somebody there has to think out of the box, or we just become very global.
Well, it sounds like a very creative and successful model that you've implemented there, Michael. I do have a few follow-up questions, and I would just open it up to Amy or Durhane if you have any questions or comments to add from what Michael and Jean-Philippe already shared. And I know Jean-Philippe has a few more comments that he would like to make as well.
Can I make a comment? Oh, sorry, Amy.
Go ahead, Durhane. No, please, after you, please.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. Because no, I'm afraid that I may be speaking out of a great deal of ignorance. So I apologize right up front if that's the case. But listening to both Michael and Jean-Philippe, I'm actually really, well, I won't say depressed, but I am really concerned because it sounds like, there is a great deal of disjoint research that's taking place. It sounds a little bit like the early days of just research for rare diseases, where you had a lot of cottage industry, you had researchers who were working, on the side, and it sounds like what's needed is a lot of co-jointed projects. There needs to be a big effort as opposed to a whole lot of little efforts. And that these whole lot of little efforts all working on their own. And what Michael says, and through some serendipity, you might know that somebody else is doing something that might be useful to you, it's not going to get us there. And maybe this is helping me understand something that really puzzles the patient community. How come it's taking so long? I mean, it's even taking so long within one gene development. I know the first patient who got a gene therapy for one of the lysosomal storage diseases. That was 6 years ago. We have 2 other patients being treated, like everybody's saying, like, what's going on? I don't mean that as a negative, quite frankly, but is there a big bang effort that's needed? Do we need to kind of bring everybody together? Do we need to do what the Orphan Drug Act did in the US and dump a whole lot of incentives out there to really make it so that we can de-risk this? Because that's what it sounds like. So, gene therapy for us is, it is the holy grail, and it's going to save all of us. And I think, we certainly as patient community would be really happy to stand up and, and beat that drum as much as possible to be able to make it happen. As one of the patients said to me, you know what, I can get a vaccine for COVID. I ain't going to die of COVID. I cannot get access to a treatment that's going to save me. So I think that's where we want to go.
Yeah, well, Durhane, one of the reasons that we're doing this panel is to bring to light some of the challenges of operating in Europe and to have an exploration through the sponsorship of a multi-stakeholder alliance like ARM to improve the ecosystem, both on a policy perspective, a patient service perspective, a academic research, investor funding, and probably most importantly, like operationally, how can you actually navigate through the myriad of different rules and regulations and policies across Europe? And I see Amy vigorously nodding her head in agreement, so I'll turn the mic over to her.
No, I mean, Durhane, your comments, of course, resonate with me as a patient advocate, and especially rare disorders because of patient enrollment challenges. It's the extended reach that's necessary. So we talk about some of the investigator pharma limitations that the EU stakeholders face. I think by contrast, actually, the patient population has been remarkably well informed, and even as Janet Lambert has pointed out to us, the participation in clinical studies has per capita in some EU countries has outperformed the US. So it's this tautology where you've got, especially for rare disease, but not limited to, including also oncology we're seeing, but really in rare disease, it's just that difficulty in enrolling requires an extended reach. And I do think that the EU has an advantage in that regard. Again, where there may be some funding or coordination issues, especially when you have multiple jurisdictions in a single continent to coordinate, which adds additional complexity for funding and for standards coordination. But I really have been personally very impressed with the patient participation and education level in the EU. And I think that really bestows an advantage for the broader EU ecosystem in this CGT environment.
Thank you, Amy. Jean-Philippe.
I just wanted to give an example of, so we are a clinical stage company developing a product in Wilson, and the initial story is very interesting. It started with the funding of a family who had Wilson disease at the CIMA Center at the University of Navarra, and Gloria Gonzalez submitted an IP in 2014, so did the research before. Now in 2021, we're going to treat the first patient. So effectively it takes time, but with all these efforts and passion and translational work, assembling the funding, assembling the support, and we have a partnership with Pfizer on this, it's clear that that's very important because we need a lot of money to do that. And it takes time because it's complex, it's production, but from the patient's idea and willingness to get something, I'm sure a lot of things can happen. But and just one last comment on the research part. I mean, there's in France, for example, the Association for the Muscular Duchenne Dystrophy Patient and Genital, but they had a lot of programs, like 30 different genes, I believe. There's only one actually currently run by this company. The rest have been sold or licensed. So we need also a lot of fundings and capabilities to do it. But things will happen, but I agree, it takes more time than we want.
Yeah. Why don't we pivot to our next topic, which were trends and challenges in clinical development of gene therapies across Europe. And Amy and I had an opportunity to have a conversation last week, and I got some very vivid insights from her in the real world experience that she and her team, together with her partners at various sponsors, have been encountering. And I thought it would be really insightful to share with the audience, what is it really like to live in developing gene therapy on a day-by-day basis and operating across multiple modalities in Europe. And then, Michael and Jean-Philippe, feel free to share your perspectives as well.
Yeah, well, so, there's just a preponderance of compatibility issues in this market, right? There's, on the one hand, these mechanisms are iterating so quickly in excess of Moore's law. And then you have all of these different jurisdictional insights that have, again, add a layer of complexity because the paradigms are shifting so quickly. So one example that Bob references that we focus on daily at our company and with our partners in pharma and the other ecosystem service providers we work with closely is chain of identity. So our market has a requirement for unique patient identifiers that ensure right patient, right therapy, right time. And the way in which that framework has come about in terms of what is that chain of identity, what does it look, how is it configured, what does it look like, how is it used, how do the stakeholders participate in securing that chain of identity is a mosaic. So if you've seen, we joke that if you've seen one chain of identity, you've seen one chain of identity. Unfortunately, because things are moving so rapidly and there is a lack of coordination, even something as seemingly mundane as a chain of identity is absolutely crucial for patient safety. And that level of ad hoc kind of approach to every therapeutic manufacturer having their own chain of identity framework contributes to excess complexity right on top of the kind of inherent complexity that we have in the new paradigms we're all supporting here. So those are, again, practical matters because not only are we requiring therapeutic manufacturers and their manufacturing partners to align on a chain of identity, but we're asking healthcare providers to interpret those chains of identity. And so how you treat PHI and where GDPR comes in or doesn't come in, where it's applicable. There is no concerted universal convention, whether it's in the continent of EU or APAC or US. And that's a huge opportunity for us to reduce complexity, streamline, because right now we want to reduce interpretation, right? There's a lot of interpretation going on when the process is the product, as we're seeing in this market. So anytime we can take abstraction down and we can make a clear set of sort of parameters or guidelines that are very visible to all of these dependent stakeholders, including patients, by the way, who are the ultimate owners of their own chain of identities. We think of that as sort of a low-hanging fruit. Again, there's exponential complexity and standards opportunities in this market. But that's just kind of a real world, like down on the sort of on the ground floor, shop floor level, how we're actually going to upscale these technologies. There's all sorts of other sort of mechanistic compatibility issues. But just some of the basics, the fundamentals that we can get in place now will accelerate our opportunity to really expand, not just the investigations, but ultimately the access to patients. So hopefully that helps elucidate some of again, there's a long list of opportunities to take practical kind of manufacturing, blocking and tackling and help find a way to scale out so that this really does become, to your point, Durhane, earlier, so we can actually get more patients into this funnel and see more benefits more quickly.
Yeah, there is something that resonates, and maybe this is going to add to the bad feeling a little bit. And one of the parameters that would help in the manufacturing space do these kind of things would be standards that are applicable and reliable, right? But currently in the space, there are no transferable standards. So while I think that Pfizer has very good standards and they will, and batch to batch controls and so on and so forth, they still will not be transferable easily to a comparable program, right? Mm-hmm. Or even a competitive program. And that is something that, you know, I continuously revisit is the idea, how can we identify a pre-competitive space where we can at least agree on how to define a product and how to define the impact that a particular manufacturing process has on the potency of a product, because each process has sort of different impacts. And to me, this potentially could be pre-competitive, right? Because at the end, what we'll have is more potent products in a space. But I haven't yet found an ideal vessel to talk to, because not only because people are not ready, yes, people would be ready to have these discussions, but the space is so broad right now. You know, vectors consist of capsids. No two companies these days are starting new programs with the same capsid. How can you standardize them? And how can you relate back to a manufacturing process, which then will allow you to a scaling evaluation and so on. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, really. I think that's what it boils down to, and maybe an agreement to be found as to what are the key steps that we can do to start comparing our programs and to start learning from each other also in that sense. Small bit.
I would just echo that point. I do think that the platforms like the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult in the UK, the CCRM in Canada, CIRM in the US are set up really to establish GMP process for GTMP and support clinical trial design as well. I mean, but to harmonize, and my hope is that we can take a couple of demonstration cases, bring them down, carry them all the way through, carry process all the way through. To your point, we are in a very broad paradigm. It's broadening literally every day.
Mhm.
So specificity is king. If we can find a narrow use case to then build momentum from, where we follow a GMP process, we harmonize it all the way through. I think that's where, as an industry, we have to focus. And the opportunity is there. I mean, these platforms are set up, they just have to be aligned. And I think they have to be given a focus with a target. And so perhaps, Michael, that could be your company. But, you know, again, I think they need some concrete use cases to demonstrate. And then we broaden the aperture because, as you say, the paradigms continue to expand.
Yeah.
Jean-Philippe, any perspectives to share with us on this particular topic? I know that you're going to be soon initiating a clinical trial for your Wilson's disease gene therapy program, and I'm just curious, you know, from your perspective. I know things are complicated because you've been operating in the world of the COVID pandemic and some constraints that's been applied to your efforts. But maybe just broadly on the themes that Amy and Michael have just discussed, you know, how do you view those?
I mean, clearly, if we have to look at clinical trial development, in Europe, there's unfortunately a lot of regulations. It takes a lot of important GMO regulation, center qualification, and effectively we have all of these questions on the manufacturing. So we decided, and before I was a chief operating officer of GeneSight, we've done a lot of clinical trials in Europe, starting in France, expanding in other countries, but things that there's been a lack of attractivity for Europe, unfortunately, compared to US. And now most even of a European company may start clinical trial in the US at some point, because the process is much more smoothly in quotes. And there's one organism like the FDA, and then you have the RIBs, there's other things. But in Europe, you have to go through every country, through CTA, every GMO regulation, specifically every center qualifications. And it takes a lot of energy and time. And that takes money as well, because time is money for efficiency in clinical trials. But there's a lot of willingness of European patients to contribute to any. And coming to the products, for example, it's clear that we will not get the same question as we have in Europe and US. So you can get a clinical trial approved in US and still have a lot of pending questions in Europe, when you're going to say at the end of the day, okay, I'm dropping the country. And that's what we may end up doing at some point. So, and we will come to patient discussion and patient how can help. I'm happy they get involved early in some, I would say, strategic discussion and endpoints, but not so well in the conduct and the realization of these clinical trials. So, and one point you raised, Bob, is a COVID. It's clear that COVID is affecting the access to hospital. And a patient are scared of getting contaminated. There's much less space to get access for the patients. There's a lot of exams in gene therapy. Let's be clear. It's the first trial has a lot of safety things we want to control. And as soon as we're getting mature on the safety points and how to handle the products, we'll be more relaxed in quotes. But we have to pay a lot of attention, and safety is first. That's the first thing we have to handle, is safety first for the first patient and the other ones. But that means we do a lot of exams, spend a lot of time at the hospitals. That's taking time for patients, and his commitment and our commitment are very important. But COVID is not helpful clearly at the moment. So we need to go where the vaccines are to get access more rapidly, therefore. Mm-hmm. But in Europe, every company I know are significantly affected in every trial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe just a few comments on the standardization of manufacturing processes and analytical methods, Michael, that you raised. I would just like to share for the broader ARM meeting on the med audience that ARM is actually a key sponsor of the gene manufacturing and analytical method standardization project, which was very successful when they did this back a few years ago for the A-body standardization effort, which was part of monoclonal antibodies. So I think there's a hope with efforts like the gene initiative that there'll be a much broader and more transparent conversation about how standardization can reduce complexity, reduce cost for sponsors, increase the efficiency and robustness of manufacturing processes, and at the end, enable the production of higher quality, more consistent products. So I think there's a recognition that this is an area where the whole sector, and it's not particularly limited to any type of gene therapy, but just broadly, that standardization has many benefits, and it can be done, I believe, and as a board member of ARM and on the executive committee, I know it's a position that ARM feels very constructively positive about, that these are the types of things that we as a multi-stakeholder alliance need to do for the benefit of the sector and ultimately for the benefit to the patients that we serve. So we're a very strong proponent of that, in my role both at Pfizer and also as an ARM board member. So I just wanted to kind of punctuate that point for the benefit of the audience who may not be aware that some of these initiatives are actually underway. And for the gene report, that should be coming out, I believe, on time in 2021.
Great.
Amy, I was just curious, again, with the knowledge now that I have about the work that you and your team are doing with sponsors, in addition to the chain of identity topic, are there other very pragmatic, day-to-day, week-to-week types of constraints that you see operating in Europe that you could bring to life for the audience to just broaden the education? Not so much that we want Durhane to be concerned concerned about the scope of the challenges and the complexity, but with the hopeful view that as they're well recognized and we put more time and energy to addressing them and improving the streamlining of the regulatory frameworks and the ability to companies and sponsors to operate in Europe across gene therapy, that these are the types of conversations we really need to bring to life for policymakers, and also not just at the EU level, but within the individual countries as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Yes, and the good news is they're readily addressable issues. So, and ARM has a whole nother conference to sponsor on blocking and tackling obstacles to scale out for our field. So we'll have more time, no doubt. This is going to be an ongoing discussion. One other a seemingly kind of mundane or pedestrian issue is labeling. So obviously, if you mislabel a product, it's potentially a deadly event. So the way in which you, just like with a chain of identity, the way in which you're configuring labels, irrespective of where you are in the R&D life cycle or obviously in commercial phase, each country in the EU is not one-to-one on what they require for labeling. And so again, if we could find a way just within the continent, but ideally across markets, major markets, including APAC and the US, we really could find a way to simplify, again, remove some of what we hear are commentary from our HCP partners, like inscrutability. If you have a label that's inscrutable, you're really compromising patient safety. And again, I appreciate that PHI is incredibly paramount and important to protect, and each country has their own supervisory controls over PHI in the EU. Some are aligned, some are not. But again, I think this is where we have an opportunity as an industry to say, let's find this sort of MVP on labeling configuration and align around that so that we're removing interpretation. This is another example where patients have also gotten involved because frankly, they are the most invested in ensuring they receive the right therapy. And so I do think there's again, some specific action steps we can take to build momentum. There are many more issues, right, that affect the compatibility issue in the EU is significant, even perhaps more significant than the US because of all the jurisdictional controls that are having to be managed concurrently. Let's get to those as soon as possible, but let's start with some of the sort of, again, at least apparently more simple problems to solve together and collectively. So that's another example. There's a long laundry list, Bob, again, apparently pedestrian items, but ones that really affect how we're scaling out and our scale out potential for this marketplace.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing those very real life case studies, Amy. Much appreciated. And Durhane, maybe turn to you as you're listening to this conversation and you see some of the, very unique, maybe pedestrian and mundane challenges as Amy has described them, that, these are real life challenges that we as a collective ecosystem really need to address to improve our overall ability to more rapidly and cost effectively develop transformational therapies for patients. So I just want to turn it to you now to share your insights and the experience that you have. I know that you've been interacting with numerous other patient advocacy groups in different forums, to maybe share with us the collective view of, and your own personal perspective on, how can we best incorporate the patient voice in our research and development activities related to gene therapy, and how can we amplify your voice as a collective community, maybe through forums like ARM and others, to accomplish the goals of being a more efficient and more productive ecosystem.
No, thank you very much. And this has been such an enlightening conversation in terms of understanding, as you say, the specific challenges, but also the opportunities. And I love what Amy says, we've had lots of, patient engagement, in different aspects of it to actually be able to stimulate that. So I guess that's what I would put on the table. I mean, we know in every other aspect in terms of research and development, in terms of therapeutic developments, that the patient engagement is paramount, and certainly in the rare diseases. And we've seen everything from not just the fundraising, but the ability, for instance, you think about the world, the patients to be able to work collectively around the globe to say, we will be able to help source the right patients by having patient registries, so that when you've got a therapy that's going to be here and you need that patient population, we can find it because we've got them organized. I think this is the same kind of challenge we've been having discussions around in terms of data, and that is data sharing. Again, essential to everything that we're doing and moving forward, but we have a lot of different unique country specific, but also even more local jurisdiction specific concerns about how do you data share. Also things about platforms, what is the way in which we can get that information to be shared. So we hear it, but I think again, where the patients can provide that input, number one is understanding what patients are willing to tolerate or not. I think, a lot of the big issues in some of the early research were, well, no, the patients would never go for that, or the patients would absolutely reject that. Or, if we have no death, everybody's going to walk away, which was kind of the beginning. But I think the more we educate the patients and bring them in, the more they are able to help be that kind of especially the patient organizations, right? They're able to be that conduit in terms of the broader community. But I think as well as what all of you are saying, and for me in a very simplistic kind of a way, is I do believe that we can contribute greatly to, number one, calling for greater collaboration, cooperation, or what Michael says in terms of harmonization. I mean, certainly harmonization in the regulatory space has become hugely important when we get to the point of being able to approve these products, right? And so again, patients have really, I think, stepped up to try to help make sure that we can enforce that message and almost insist on it. I think it's really challenging, if you, as you say, you drill down in each one of those issues, but I also think it cannot be addressed unless you've got an overall culture that says, yeah, you know what, we've got to be able to bring this together. I mean, it's like climate change, in some respects, right? Once you've kind of come together to recognize, okay, these are not problems that we're going to be able to solve if everybody has their own solution. And in fact, if you've got 2 or 3 that basically say we don't buy in, the whole thing can fall apart. So as much effort, and I love, the idea there even is an arm. I had no idea there was such a thing as arm. And so how can we support that? One of the things that we were just at an international patient conference, and they asked the CEO there, what's the most important message you would say? And he said, get a seat at the table. And I'm going to really push that. You need a seat, you need to have a patient. You need to have a patient seat at the table that can kind of continue to encourage you to work in that way collaboratively, but also to be a conduit back. And if it's political will that you need, who is better to actually forge that than the patient community itself. So I'm actually quite heartened with the fact that certainly something like Pharm does exist and these kinds of discussions are taking place. But I'm also really now challenging, I guess everybody say, now let's work at that level. You know, it's not, okay, this is a problem, we've got an issue, but what do we do to overcome that, and how do we make that happen? So really, I think, you know, the patient voice in every single way, but also then back to, as you say, at a very practical level. I mean, I'm really delighted with Jean-Philippe talking about in terms of the, you know, research on Wilson's disease. It's one of those communities that's very close to our heart, certainly in terms of the huge challenges for the patient, but also the recognition that, you know, the opportunities in terms of that kind of treatment is so huge. So yeah, I think, you know, the more we can be informed and educated, the more we can bring some of these challenges into the patient community. But the more, on the other hand, you've got the patients, nothing else than an advocate and a cheerleader, and maybe somebody that, you know, continues to say, come on, you know, how do we kind of work together, as you say, for the good of the patients, and to make sure that there's somebody keeping their eye on that level of the dialogue.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective, Durhane. And I'll speak for my other panelists that we will always keep an open seat at the table for you and any other patient advocates to join us as we look for ways to improve our ability to serve our patient communities. We're kind of nearing the end of our time, and first, I'd like to thank you all for participating in the panel, and maybe we'll just go around the table with, you know, a few closing remarks on how you view the progress thus far today. Where do you see some potential exciting inflection points, and what gets you excited about as we're progressing through 2021 and beyond about the gene therapy field in Europe? And Amy, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Jean-Philippe, Michael, and then we'll close with Durhane and myself.
Yeah, well, moving away from some of the more pedestrian topics, one area of advance that I see where, yeah, again, the EU could have a real competitive advantage is in RWE and a cross-border analysis on long-term safety and efficacy. There's just kind of an inborn, not just because some of the countries have nationalized health programs, and so then differential access to data overall. But that RWE infrastructure is getting more attention now as we're seeing more volume come forward. And I think the opportunity for a more heterogeneous continental view that then can be expanded beyond to other markets and compared to other domains and geographies really gives us an opportunity to look more heterogeneously at this marketplace too. So I'm very excited about RWE and the potential here. And I do think that the EU could take a real lead in this regard.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Amy. Jean-Philippe?
I think I will give you a few points. First of all, I think there's going to be in the next 2 or 3 years, I hope 2 or 3 products on the market. And listening to Durhane, I was thinking there's one great value patient can bring on top of all of the knowledge of the disease, and which might be a different view than the doctor, is a registry. A registry, well-structured, could be an extremely great value because it could help for the design, it will help for regulatory, it will help for natural history, it will help for educating the agencies. And there's so much work sometimes to be done. That's a great value. And this is where I guess some patient associations have invested and should continue to invest at the experimentation for LHON or Wilson. One thing we need to think for Europe is how to change the future market access and to prepare better the countries over their valuation, regulation, pricing. Otherwise, we're going to be the last one to get a product. And I said, Michael, harmonization and manufacturing, we need also bioproduction in Europe. Otherwise, we'll be dependent too much on the US or Asia at some point.
Wholeheartedly concur with those remarks, Jean-Philippe. Michael?
Yeah, so you know, I'm very privileged to sort of have insight on a daily basis with academics that are working on new concepts for therapies. Obviously, we're biotech, and on a daily basis, I talk to my pharma colleagues at UCB. And the unifying message that I get back is really an image of enthusiasm for this modality that has a lot of promise, and people recognize this, and it's almost difficult to sometimes keep people away and say, wait, yes, it's great, you want to be part of this, but let's do this right all together. So the level of enthusiasm is there, very positive. I think the level of technology is enhanced every turn and every day. So we get actually better at this. And I think the most reassuring bit is that gene therapy is migrating into a space where we're now really starting to think of making medicines rather than big announcements, right? So in the beginning, I think it was clear that we needed some concepts to work out in the lab and ultimately also in patients, but the real work starts after that. And that is how do we take it from a proof of concept to a medicine that can help patients. And what I see in the context of my colleagues and what I've seen also at Pfizer and other places is that there's a lot of thought and work going into these sometimes dull aspects of development. We're starting to get it. We're starting to get it right, and I think there's a lot. There's a lot of opportunity in there and reason for optimism as well. Taking this in the context of Europe, we now see that, Novartis, Roche, UCB, all these European pharma company are going to be part of this journey. And I think together, if we find these touch points where we can help each other, I think we can accelerate the progress in a sense. So it won't take another 6 years before another patients get dosed.
Well, thank you for sharing those insights. Durhane, why don't we'll turn to you to wrap things up from the patient perspective, and then I'll make a few closing remarks afterwards.
Well, I really want to thank Amy, Jean-Philippe, and Michael for bringing it back to those notes of ways in which we have seen how patients can get involved, and certainly real-world evidence, as Amy talked about. I mean, the project in Europe, Data Saves Lives, has been instrumental in helping patients understand why they actually need to contribute their data and what they get back from, but also the safeties around it. And as Jean-Philippe says, again, the more we can focus on having patients actually construct those patient registries, doing the natural patient history so that we've got, those as comparison data moving forward. I think, again, as you're all saying, it feels like, we've got the platforms for having patients much more engaged. You and pharma know that. You pioneered the patient engagement, but we also know the EMA and the FDA have also opened up tremendously the patient engagement. So I think using some of those models and some of those platforms to say, okay, how can we better now insert the patient community into what we're doing on a research and development process from the very beginning? And then thinking, as Amy's talking about, what do we need at the end in terms of getting the marketing? Because I think that's where a lot of the challenges happen as well. I think we all knew too well, Amy, our first rare disease drug the first gene therapy that was actually invented or discovered in Canada, Glybera, and then ended up never getting to the patients. And there's still not another therapy that actually works. So how do we make sure that we don't avoid that, right? And that's a tremendous amount of not just financial investment, but patient investment. So bringing the patients in at the beginning and looking at not just what do we need to do to get all on the way, but the focus is how do we make sure we've got the market access set up right? So tremendously, I think, valuable as we can see it in terms of the patient involvement, and look forward as much as possible. And Bob knows I've got a secret request to actually try to engage some of you to come and speak to us as we're doing our patient education seminar. So we need you to come and talk to the patients as well. So I think that's the next thing that I would look forward to, talking to your peers and talking to, the regulators, et cetera, is important, but, coming and talking to the patient community would mean so much.
Well, Durhane, thanks again for those comments. And, please know that we're ready to warmly engage with you and your organization, as well as all the other patient advocacy groups around the globe, not just focused on Europe, but globally. So we've come to the conclusion of our time allotment. So Amy, Durhane, Jean-Philippe, Michael, thank you very much for participating in the panel and sharing your very thoughtful insights. I was certainly learned a lot from the conversation, and I know that this will be a valuable panel for the ARM Meeting on the Med audience, and look forward to meeting you all sometime soon in person, maybe next year at this meeting. So with that, goodbye.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.
so much.
Thank you very much.